Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the 15th meeting of this committee in 2021. This is an evidence session with the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, MSP. And I can confirm that Ms Sturgeon took the affirmation at the start of this morning's evidence session. When we broke up, we were talking about the judicial review. We'll carry on with that, and I'll now go to Dr Alasdair Allan.
Thank you very much, Convener. We spent some time before the break talking about external legal advice. So can I ask you, First Minister, what role does external counsel play in determining the government's position, legal position usually? And did this case in any way depart from that?
I think it's quite hard for me, maybe that's just a kind of deficiency in my own communication skills, to kind of almost scientifically answer the first part of your question. You know, external counsel in, you know, a serious piece of litigation play a big role. They conduct the litigation, they, you know, draft the pleadings, they give advice, as you've now seen. And their advice, I suppose I would say, is very, very important, and it carries a lot of weight. And then it is, I suppose, weighed with other factors, the sort of, in some judicial reviews, the small p political public interest issues, and of course for ministers on matters of this seriousness, the views of the law officers, which take account of all of these things, are what matters in terms of the Ministerial Code. Did this happen in the same way as other litigation? So in terms of the conduct of the litigation, put to one side the catastrophic error that became evident at the end of December, which I like to think is not in any way normal. I suppose you'd have to ask litigators and government lawyers whether the conduct of the litigation was anything out of the ordinary. In my experience, bar, you know, the seriousness of the issues that emerged that ultimately led to the loss of the judicial review, I wouldn't say it was particularly out of ordinary. For me, you know, this was a former First Minister taking the government to court. It was my former, you know, boss, friend, mentor, long-time associate taking the government to court. It wasn't in that sort of sense normal, and I don't think, you know, it didn't lead, in my view, to a significant or a significantly appreciable difference to my degree of involvement. But of course, there are elements that mean it didn't feel entirely normal, and I can't remember if this is absolutely correct, but from my memory, you know, meeting with counsel, for example, to kind of satisfy myself that we still had a stateable case and discuss it directly with them would not be absolutely a routine thing for the First Minister to do in every piece of litigation.
Thank you. We've mentioned already, well, we've talked a fair bit about the timeline of all this, and we've looked at how the 6th, or perhaps arguably the 11th of December, was a crucial date in terms of the advice being offered. Was a more crucial moment the view, a change in the views, or a view expressed by the law officers rather than merely by external counsel?
So obviously external counsel were conducting the litigation. So in that later part of December, the Commission on Diligence, I can't remember if that's the technical term of it, was happening, and they were conducting that. So they were at the front line, and you know, there is maybe an element to which I owe them an apology as well, because the conduct of that was not what you would ever want it to be, and they were in a situation they should not have been in terms of documents coming to light that hadn't previously come to light. So that, obviously, they were at the sharp end on the front line, informing the view that Murdo Fraser read out copious quotes from the 19th of December opinion later on. Obviously, then the Lord Advocate and law officers have to take account of that. There was discussions, I think I said earlier on, I discussed on the phone on my way back up from London, I think on the 19th, the deteriorating position. I saw the Lord Advocate the following day. I don't want to sit here and quote him, but I think by that point, you know, he was pretty much of the view that this was, if not unstateable, fast becoming unstateable. So, and that then led to the process that was commissioned by the Permanent Secretary, I think on Boxing Day, And then ultimately that led to the Sarah Davidson advice and the decision we took, which, you know, formally, technically, and I think she said this before the committee, that was the Permanent Secretary's decision, but I would not want to leave the committee with anything other than the impression that I was involved in that, I was being properly consulted and I was part of that decision, and I stand by that decision.
Finally, Convener, again on matters of timing, as you're aware, there has been an accusation put to this committee that the Scottish Government assisted the case to allow the criminal trial to take over and the judicial review to be stopped before it reached a decision. Those are obviously serious allegations. It's your opportunity to respond to them.
The Scottish Government didn't assist the case and never asked to assist the case, so there's a kind of factual flaw in that hypothesis to start with. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Convener, the Deputy First Minister said there may be more information on the assisting consideration yet to come to the committee, but assisting was considered at an early stage. And again, I suppose from my non-expert opinion, given the circumstances at an early stage of this, when there was a criminal investigation also underway or at the early stages, I think it would have been extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, if the question of assisting hadn't even arisen in our considerations. But certainly my memory of those early discussions, and by early I'm talking, you know, over September, early mid-September, maybe a bit longer than that, the preference seemed to be, if I recall it correctly, in favour of reporting restrictions as opposed to assisting. And ultimately, and I think this was the end of September, the 27th of September is the one that comes into my mind right now, the lawyers for Alex Salmond made a motion to the court for reporting restrictions, and the Scottish Government didn't oppose that. So that kind of, at that point, put the assisting thing, which from my memory, and obviously I wasn't part of every discussion with lawyers, was never a really serious thing that the Scottish Government was intending to do. And I don't have a recollection, again, I can't sit here and say it was never discussed or I didn't ask any questions about it, but I don't recall at a later stage assisting was ever something that was being considered in any sense by the government. And the fact is we never made an application to assist. But generally, this idea that we were gaming, and these are my words and I'm just using them for shorthand, that we were gaming the timing of the judicial review to allow a police investigation to overtake it is absurd and bizarre and just completely without any evidential or factual foundation. Firstly, I think, as you can see, and the committee can take a view on whether they think our decisions on the judicial review were right or wrong, but you can see from the advice, the process that was being gone through. And the idea that we could have done that, it would have involved the police, us knowing what was going on in the police investigation, what the timing of that was, and the police being prepared. And it's just absurd. And anybody who suggests otherwise is, I think, stretching the credibility of even the most devout conspiracy theorists. And the evidence that was put forward for that, I use evidence loosely, the assisting thing, which I just don't think happened in that way, and then messages. You know, the four messages, and I'll be careful because the convener reminded me of this earlier on, but they were put forward in evidence to this committee as somehow, you know, substantiating this idea. I looked at these four messages. One, as I say, the committee, I think, has seen, and as part of what it's seen before. I think a couple of them were right around the time the whole thing became public, before the judicial review had even got properly off the ground. And if memory serves me correctly, I may be getting the 1 and 2 round the wrong way here. The other one was after the judicial review, I think it was 2 after the judicial review had already collapsed. You know, I'm sitting here as if I'm, you know, having to kind of go through step by step to debunk this. I mean, it is just, it's absurd. And I don't think absurdity should probably be given the amount of time I'm taking to debunk it.
Thank you, Convener.
Margaret Mitchell, please.
Thank you, Convener. First Minister, can I refer you to your recent submission and the entry date 5th of July 2018, where there's a discussion with Alex Salmond about arbitration. He says that arbitration is rejected because the Scottish Government is confident in the legality of the process. My senior counsel believes it is unlawful. That's the whole point of the arbitration. The legality will have to be resolved in either private, in a confidential and binding arbitration, or in public at the Court of Session. The Scottish Government and you have everything to gain from arbitration. If my legal advice is wrong, I will accept that and the current process proceeds. If the Scottish Government legal advice is wrong, if the Scottish Government's legal advice is wrong, you discover that without losing in a public court. Adopting an arbitration process also guarantees confidentiality for the complainers, regardless of what happens. Can you explain why these arguments were rejected?
It wasn't my decision. I can give you a view on the appropriateness or otherwise of arbitration, but it wasn't my decision. That was part of the process of the handling of the investigation that I wasn't involved in and didn't intervene in. So you heard from the Lord Advocate, who's much more qualified to comment on these things than me. I think there is a question, I'll put it no more strongly than that, about whether arbitration would have been an appropriate process to resolve issues that actually should be resolved in a court. These are public policy, public law issues. Arbitration, and I'm simplifying here, tends to be about settling private disputes between companies, for example. So I do think there is a very big question about whether arbitration would have been appropriate, but the government, as part of the investigation and part of the process of that, were considering that. The question for me, because that's I think from what you read out there, that's a message from Alex Salmond to me, suggesting that I should be intervening to help bring about that process of arbitration. So on that point, put aside whether you think arbitration was a good thing or a bad thing, that the government should have done it or not have done it. The point is, I think it would have been highly inappropriate for me to intervene on Mr. Salmon's behalf to try to bring any particular outcome about. This was an investigation that I was not part of, I had no role in, I wasn't even supposed to know about it. And I would have been intervening on behalf of a friend and a colleague and an associate. The complainers didn't have the ability to come to me to ask me to intervene to get something that they wanted to happen in the process. I don't know whether they would ever have wanted to do, but that I would have been given him privileged influence in a process in which I wasn't meant to have part. Now, I tell you something, people have strong views about my conduct, and that is perfectly correct, and I'll defend that, and I will, take people's judgment of that. But if I had done that, if I was sitting here right now, having done that, I think the criticism that would be raining down on my head would be absolutely and utterly justified.
Here's my problem with that, First Minister. We've got the former First Minister of Scotland, who has had a reputation for knowing procedure, for running a very competent government. And he's coming to you, he's told us on record, that he was reluctant to take the government, which he had been First Minister of, to a judicial review. So he's explaining to you there is another way. And it seems to him, apparently, that if, as First Minister, you're taking all the considerations into account, including that you are custodian of the public purse, you do not have a blank cheque just to write to pursue what might not be necessary action. So it seems then, his argument that that would save the taxpayer a whole lot of money and that would be prudent. It would establish if the procedure was lawful, and if it was lawful, then the complaints, etc., could go ahead. But crucially too, it would also have protected the anonymity of the complainers. Now, you've said that's rejected, and what I'm wondering this morning, in all the evidence we've heard and all the mistakes, somebody surely has to be held responsible. And what I'm not hearing is where the division of powers is, from our independent civil service to the ministerial responsibility. You very graciously seem to be taking responsibility for that all. But that doesn't help accountable, transparent and open government. People need to know how this happened and why that was rejected. And can I just say, lastly, you would have been criticised because you hadn't brought this forward in a public forum. That suggests to me that political considerations outweighed the public purse considerations, the anonymity of the complainers and the reputation of this Scottish Government and by extension the Parliament.
I feel very strongly about this aspect, and people are entitled to different views, but I'll give you my view straight. And I do think it goes to the heart of the appropriate exercise of power and not abusing power. And it goes to the heart, therefore, of trust and integrity in government. First of all, though, I can't let pass the opportunity to thank you for your verdict that the government in which I was Deputy First Minister for all these years was a competent government. I'm sure that we will reflect well on that.
I think we helped you out a little bit when you were a minority government. And
minority governments... Anyway, I'm not going to go down that road. So, putting that slightly flippant point aside, you make a lot of assumptions there, and with respect, you conflate a lot of different things and a lot of different roles, and I understand why, but I'm going to try and unpack them a little bit, if that's okay. You make an assumption that arbitration would have avoided all of the problems that occurred that occurred in this process. I think that is a massive leap of logic. Nobody knows that. The government, in a process that I was not part of, because I was expressly excluded from it in this procedure, was undoubtedly considering the arguments that Alex Salmond's lawyers were putting forward in favour of arbitration, and they decided for the reasons that they decided that arbitration was not an appropriate thing to do. And I think you probably have canvassed this with the Lord Advocate and the Permanent Secretary, but the Permanent Secretary would be the one that would make that judgment. The question for me at this point, because this was not a procedure, a process of investigation I was involved in, is would it have been right for me to intervene? Now, you said, you know, he's a former First Minister. He is a former First Minister. He was a former First Minister when he was asking me to do this. But he was also the person who was subject to complaints that were being investigated. And he was seeking to get me to intervene in that process of investigation on his behalf in a way that would have departed from the terms of the procedure and would have been trying on his behalf to put the investigation down a track that he hoped would avoid the complaints, the decisions, the complaints ever coming to a point of decision. Now, even if you think Alex Salmond's legal advice, and that's all he's putting forward, his legal advice is right, and even if you think that arbitration is something the Scottish Government should have done, I think both of those points can be rebutted strongly. The point for me is, would it have been appropriate for me to intervene on behalf of my friend and colleague and former boss in a process of investigation that I wasn't meant to have part in? And as First Minister, I think if I had done that, whatever you think about the merits of what he was arguing for, if I had used my role, my influence, my power to get him an outcome he wanted, not as a former First Minister, but as the person who was subject to these complaints, I think that would have been an egregious breach of my power. I think it would have been wrong and deeply inappropriate. And, you know, maybe had I done it, an arbitration had happened, and maybe if you turned out to be right and I had made it all go away, we'd never have found out. But say we had found out. I was saying I'd still be sitting here. I don't think I'd still be sitting here, because I don't think anybody would have accepted that that was a reasonable, legitimate or acceptable way for a First Minister to behave. And I think, frankly, there would have been a lot more justification in that criticism than, if I may say so, in some of the criticisms that are being levelled at me. And I'm sorry, there is, in all of this, there's been a lot of personal angst for me and others, you know, me least of all, in all of this. But for me, one of the hardest things, which is maybe why I let him down more gently than I intended to on that 2nd of April meeting. Sitting and saying no to a friend who's asking you for help is a tough thing to do. And, you know, it has had big implications for me and my relationship with him. But was it the right thing to do? Absolutely. And I will maintain that for as long as I live.
I think the difficulty with that, Convener, is you're the First Minister of Scotland. You're the most powerful person in Scotland, and you should be acting in the public interest. But the public interest, it seems to me, would have to be establishing whether the legal advice that you'd got, now that wasn't 100% certain that that was fine, and the legal advice that he'd got from very credible and experienced lawyers. So it wasn't like, you know, he put his finger to the wind and said, we think this is what it is. He was making material points, and you seem to have absolved yourself of any responsibility to take these points on board and act to protect the public purse, to protect the anonymity of the complainers, all to make sure that you weren't accused of covering up. That doesn't seem to me credible.
No, to make sure I didn't abuse my power as First Minister on behalf of a friend who was accused of serious sexual misconduct. And we're going to have to agree to differ on this. But remember, all of the legal arguments and legal advice he had, it wasn't that because I wasn't agreeing to intervene, the government didn't have them. The government had them. They were being properly considered in the process of the investigation. The point here is that this was a procedure, rightly or wrongly, you can have your views on the procedure, that excluded me from the process of investigation. Now, and I apologise to them in advance for naming them in this way, but it's just to illustrate a point. Say these complaints had not been against Alex Salmond. Say they'd been against Jack or Henry McLeish. They wouldn't have had the same access to come, because they, you know, like both of them and respect both of them, but they wouldn't have had the same access as Alex Salmond to me. So I would have been using my power to help a friend in a process of investigating serious complaints. And Ms Mitchell, I will maintain for as long as I live that had I done that and had it come to light, probably you included would be sitting here telling me that I had acted completely inappropriately.
I think I would have weighed up the arguments, but the point is there was a route, and arbitration was offered to the Permanent Secretary, and she rejected it. Now, that's a process that, regardless of political party, anyone could have followed, and it's what he did follow. And
he made that
others,
argument.
If you excuse me, First Ministers, it's for others to I think, look out the case I've set out and what you've said, effectively, which sounded, forgive me, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, I was going to make sure that it was exposed and he didn't get off with this. And that was my overwhelming motivation, rather than acting in the public interest at this very early stage, where, yes, if he'd been found right, you would have had to have gone back to the drawing board. Didn't mean it was the end of the matter. It could have been looked at again. A new procedure could have been put in place. It wasn't the end of it, but you choose to do something else. I don't think we're going to agree on this, but I think we've set up enough of the balancing arguments for others to make their own determination.
If the committee's conclusion is that I should have intervened, then the committee's entitled to do that. And, you know, well, my view of propriety in these things will be severely challenged at a fundamental level. But can I say, I think you were putting something to me there that I wanted to see him exposed at all costs, and I think there is a public interest. If somebody has serious complaints made against them and there is a procedure in place to allow those to be investigated, that procedure is allowed to happen without interference, political interference from somebody's powerful friend to try to divert the course that it would take. I think that is absolutely in the public interest. And that's the judgment I made. People can decide whether it was right or wrong, but I decided that if I had done what he wanted me to do, I would have been acting in a way that was improper because I was his friend. And I just don't think anybody right now would be patting me on the back if that is what I'd chosen to do. But the idea, I never wanted, I can't tell you, I can't find the words to express this strongly enough. I never, ever, ever, ever wanted to face a situation where Alex Salmond, a man I have had revered since I was 20 years old, or probably younger than that actually, was facing serious allegations of sexual misconduct. I didn't want him exposed. I didn't want any of this to happen. My conduct in all of this is rightly under scrutiny. I have no complaint about that. I have no right to have any complaint about that. But the idea I ever wanted any of this to happen, this situation, however people judge I handled it, was not a situation of my making. And I tried to handle it in the way that I thought was best overall. And I think it would have been deeply wrong for me to have intervened in a way on behalf of Alex Salmond to try to engineer the outcome he wanted. He was not some objective bystander. He wasn't a former First Minister coming to me in some matter of public policy saying, Nicola, do you think you should think about this? He was a party in this whole issue and he was asking me to intervene on his behalf. That would have been deeply inappropriate had I done so.
Do you have excuse me, do you have any other questions?
No,
Ms.
I
Mitchell?
don't. That sets out both arguments very clearly.
We'll move then to Andy Wightman.
Thanks, Convener. Just a few questions on the judicial review, and thanks to my colleague Murdo Fraser for walking us through much of the process. First of all, the petition was against Leslie Evans, the first party, and the second party with the Scottish ministers. Can you confirm that at all stages this petition was defended as essentially one petition? There were no separate decisions made or separate considerations given to the two different parties?
I think the answer to that is yes, but there may be kind of technical issues to that in terms of the consideration that lawyers made. I don't know of anything that was that. I do know at the early stage, and I can't recall all the ins and outs of this, but there was some legal consideration about whether it might be appropriate to have the petition amended so it was just the Scottish ministers and not against the Permanent Secretary individually, but I don't think that went anywhere legally.
Fine. Would it be fair to say, in response to Murdo Fraser's line of questioning, that the critical tipping point, the thing that changed everything, was the period 6th December to the 19th of December? That's the point at which Council were saying, concede or press on regardless. And then there was clearly problems with the disclosure of documents, and indeed on the 19th of December, at para 12, Roddy Dunlop says, first, we are now, he said in 11, this gives rise to two concerns. First, we are now in a position where we think that maintaining a defence of the appointment of the investigating officer may be unstatable. Given the timescales, we are reluctant to take a final view on this, but there is a real risk that we so conclude. So 6th December, 19th December was the, would you agree, the critical period?
Yes, although I would probably narrow it a bit more than that. The quotations I used earlier on summarising the view of the law officers were from the 11th of December. So up until the 11th of December, there was a belief that the case was stateable with credible arguments. So I think, I'm looking at my notes here to see if I can find this, and I'm failing at the moment, but I think it, certainly from the 11th onwards, the 14th seems, I can't remember if that's when the commission process started. So I think certainly the period 11th to the 19th I think would be more accurate, but for some reason the 14th to the 19th seems to be, in my mind, is when it really started to go badly wrong.
Okay, that's fine. No, it's not particularly important. I want to move on now just to the process of the concession. Scottish ministers decided to concede this case, and as I understand it, there was discussion at 4 o'clock on Hogmanay 2018. I'm sure the Lord Advocate was appreciating that, discussing how it should be conceded, the basis on which it could be conceded, also saying it would be useful to have Council's input in these matters before the decision goes live. and ideally before final decisions are being made on handling. I just don't note if there were any further council's input, we don't have that, but that may well be coming, but I'd be interested in that. The grounds on which ministers decided to concede this was on the basis of the inability to defend the fact that the documents had been produced after it was promised that everything was, and that related to the questions around Section 10 in the procedure. Did the petitioner have any comments on the proposals that Scottish ministers made as to the joint minute?
I would think the answer to that is yes. I wasn't involved, so, and I would have to check the precise dates here, but once the government had taken the decision to concede, there was then a process of lawyer-to-lawyer discussions about, so I think a bit like pleadings, I think the joint minute was probably discussed between the different legal teams. Council, I think the council that had been involved in the case, I think were the ones who did that, but I'd have to check the detail. So it went into effectively a legal process then about the terms of the concession, the joint minute, and of course that led to the interlocutor of Lord Pentland.
Yeah, so you agreed a joint minute. Lord Pentland then basically just issued that joint minute as an interlocutor, if in effect.
I assume so. I wasn't
Okay,
in
no
court,
problem.
so I am not going to try to speak for Lord Pentland.
No, but well, we know what Lord Pentland did say, because it's in the interlocutor that I have before me, that having heard counsel on the petitioner's motion of consent and in terms and in respect of the joint minute for parties, I finds and declares that the decisions of the first named respondent, Leslie Evans, as set out in the decision report and as set out in a letter from her to the petitioner's solicitors dated 22nd August 2018, are unlawful in respect that they were taken in circumstances which were procedurally unfair and in respect that they were tainted by apparent bias by reason of the extent and effects of the investigating officer's involvement with the aspects of the matters. It goes on. So ultimately the decision was made by the court that it was the decisions, those two decisions of Leslie Evans that were unlawful.
I'm not in a position. Yes, I assume.
Okay, what I'm trying to get at was there any suggestion, and I don't think you know the answer to this question, but was there any suggestion in this winding up period when you decided to concede, was there any discussion or any approach from the petitioner that they may have wished you to concede on not just the application of the procedure in terms of the decisions that Leslie Evans had made in this particular case, but a wish to include in that joint minute and therefore in the interlocutor some legal grounds relating to the procedure itself? Are you aware of that or not?
I think as far as I am aware, and I'd have to check that, and I wasn't party to those lawyer-to-lawyer discussions around the settlement of that, but I am not aware that that is the case, but I cannot sit here and say definitively that none of that happened.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay. Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Convener. Members of this committee, First Minister, were allowed to read the report by the former Director General of Organisation and Development and Operations, Sarah Davidson, and the Permanent Secretary said that after reading this report, and I quote, "The decision that I took was to concede. Indeed, that was also the advice that was given to ministers." So, can I ask about that decision-making process? Did the Permanent Secretary discuss this matter with you prior to making a recommendation to concede?
We discussed it on an ongoing basis over that few days period, in terms of her commissioning that note, when we got that advice, and then the decision that was taken. So we were, I was in touch with her. That was over the Christmas and New Year period. So yes, I can't sit here and tell you exactly on what day. A lot of that was by phone, obviously, given it was over the holiday period. But she was fully, this I think has been described, and it is, and she has said it here. It was the Permanent Secretary's decision. I, in no way, whatever the technicalities are, am seeking to dissociate myself from this decision. I was involved in the deliberations. I was in agreement with it, and absolutely stand behind the decision the Permanent Secretary took.
Okay. And in the Lord Advocate's evidence, he highlighted the importance of focusing on the complainers when it came to decisions to concede to the judicial review. So I suppose my question is, was the protecting of the complainers and their complaints, did that play a role in it taking quite a while to decide whether to concede the judicial review?
So I don't think you can separate that, and forgive me, I'm about to speak to, in answer to a question about complainers here in a way that will sound quite dispassionate, but this was a decision-making process in a judicial review case. So, and I recall, I think, the evidence that the Lord Advocate gave on this point. As long, and Alex Hamilton asked me something similar here, as long as this case was stateable and we thought we had an arguable, credible case, even although our prospects had deteriorated, then the wider public interest came into play, and that was the desire, if possible, to get a judicial determination on all of the grounds of challenge. And also, in addition to that, if we thought we had a chance of successfully defending this and prevailing both on the legality of the procedure and the process, then that would have been in the interests of the complainants, because it wouldn't have meant that the whole process was set aside in the way it ultimately was. So that was part of that. But you can only, in these decisions, really take account of those wider things as long as you have a stateable case. So we carried on deciding that for as long as that was the case. And when that ceased to be the case because of what happened in terms of the uncovering of information that then suggested that the IO had had greater involvement with the complainers, and that then changed the judgment we'd made about being able to defend the interpretation of Section 10, that's when the view to concede came. So, you know, a view of the complainers was an integral part of that. I think Alex Hamilton put the alternative view that it might have been better for the complainers to concede earlier and allow a new process. Now, people will take different views on that, but the interest of the complainers was part of the wider consideration. As long as the case was stateable, we should continue to defend it.
Okay, thank you. Jackie Baillie.
Thank you very much, Convener. It feels like a long time since we last spoke, First Minister. So let me try and rattle through this. Can I, sorry, I missed that one.
I said you misquoted me the last time we spoke.
But
so
you corrected me.
Perhaps, well...
And you clearly have lots of resources to do that.
I hope I don't have to do it again,
Well,
Ms.
let
Baillie.
me try and make sure that you do.
Could you two just get on with it, please?
Absolutely.
We've been doing this for years.
I've noted that throughout today, you've talked about a litany of failures. You've described them as catastrophic.
Sorry, I rest my case.
Errors, well, you have. Right? Talked about errors in the investigation. You've talked about errors in the judicial review. You've talked about errors in the supply of information. And I absolutely appreciate you apologising as the head of the Scottish Government and taking responsibility. But you're not directly responsible, are you?
Look, every single day, Ms Baillie, things happen in the Scottish Government in my, not explicitly in my name, but things happen that ultimately I'm responsible for. So, most of them go well, some of them don't go well, and I can't pick and choose what I take responsibility for. But in sense of, I wasn't directly involved in the problems that led to the judicial review collapsing, then no, I wasn't directly involved in those. But there'll be lots of things that happen in the Scottish Government that I'm not directly involved in. It doesn't mean I can sit here and say that I bear no responsibility.
I don't think I've ever heard you really describe your stewardship of any particular problem as catastrophic. I mean, you've described these errors
perhaps not
as
publicly.
Catastrophic. Okay, perhaps not publicly, but then you don't confide in me. But you have used that word. That's a strong word. Tell me why then nobody has resigned, nobody has actually taken responsibility for this. Because at the heart of this, 2 women have been really badly let down. They've had no closure in this at all.
I'm going to give you a sort of personal answer to this and then give you the sort of government answer. And forgive me, it's what, 4 hours in, I'm possibly getting too tired to safely give personal answers. So I think firstly, just technically, and Murdo Fraser will correct me if I'm getting this wrong and correct me for the official report, but I think I was responding to Murdo Fraser putting the word catastrophic, as I didn't disagree with that, I agreed with it, but it wasn't my choice of word, it was Murdo Fraser's choice of word. Yeah, sure, so I'm just, you know, we both like to be accurate on these things. I suppose there's two things. The personal, I feel very strongly, and rightly or wrongly, this situation of complaints emerging against Alec was horrendous for everybody that had to deal with it. I'm not saying it's obviously not unprecedented, but it was really, really difficult for everybody. I didn't know about it at the time people were in it originally dealing with it, but this was an invidious, difficult situation, and people got things wrong. And maybe that's made me too likely to be understanding of people who made mistakes. But the more governmental answer is we are still in the process of investigation and inquiry into all of this. If you remember back to the day that we conceded the judicial review, I think I said in Parliament that day that we were going to be instructing an independent process of investigation, which Laura Dunlop was then charged to do. We're awaiting that. We're awaiting, obviously, the recommendations and conclusions of this committee. And I think that is right and proper.
My problem with that response is that you are the head of government, you have responsibility, the policy lies on a shelf gathering dust. You know, 2 women have been failed by this. What happens in the intervening 2 years that you've taken to look at this for any woman who suffers sexual harassment?
Well, in much of the intervening 2 years, there has also been a criminal investigation. Now, I'm not saying that constrains internal things we do. The policy, to use your description, lies on the shelf. The policy is still extant. It has not been declared unlawful. And fairness at work, although we've talked previously about the perceived or actual deficiencies in fairness at work that led to the new procedure, is still there and available for those within the Scottish Government who want to come forward. I think this is probably something we all share. I have profound concerns about the impact all of this and some of the way the narrative has developed around it, the allegations that have been made, all of this. I have a profound concern about what it means for the confidence women in Scotland have in coming forward. And the government's actions are part of that. I don't deny that. But I think all of us, and I say this deliberately, I think every single one of us, after this is all over, have to think about how we repair some of that and build a culture again in Scotland where women do feel confident to come forward. And I don't shy away from the government's big responsibility in that.
Yeah, might be useful to have a policy in place that people
There
can
is a
apply
policy
to.
in place.
Well, we can debate that. Can I move on to information and let me genuinely say how frustrated I have been as a member of this committee, and I don't think I've ever felt quite so frustrated in my 22 years of being on parliamentary committees as with this one. And let me tell you why. We've waited for information from the Scottish Government. The stuff we've received has been partial. It's been late. The complaints handling phase was due in August. We received it in December. The legal advice has taken 2 votes in Parliament and a motion of no confidence in John Swinney before we saw it last night at 6 o'clock. Last night at 6 o'clock. And let me say to you, there's information missing. Reference is made in the documents to communications with Christine O'Neill. None of them are there. The information is not provided to us. Reference has been made to an urgent consultation meeting on Friday the 2nd of November. Nothing's there. It's not been given to us. Your meeting on the 13th of November, which I think is critical, as the First Minister, with the Permanent Secretary and the Chief of Staff and external legal advisors, there's nothing. Where is the consultation note of that meeting? It's not been provided to us. Now, I have to say, we've waited to the 11th hour for the legal advice. We get partial legal advice. Do you understand the frustration of the committee? Do you understand that it looks as if the government doesn't want to give us critical information? And what will you do to rectify that today?
today, I'm not sure what
Why
you
not?
want me to do. Look,
Give it to us.
I could sit here, as I have done on certain legal advice, for example, and it's not going to remove your frustration, nor would I expect it to, but I've given you an explanation of the factors that lie under that, and we can agree or disagree on that. I would also take issue with some of the characterisation of delay and, I don't think this was your word, prevarication and trying to avoid giving information. There have been really complex issues behind the provision of some of this information. Sometimes it's quantity, but often the legal constraints and the particular legal orders in place. I think the government has fully cooperated with the committee, and I think it has provided information in a proper way. But I am not going, as First Minister, that absolutely respects committees of this Parliament, I'm not going to sit here and say, listening to what you've just said to me, that I'm not going to reflect seriously on that, because of course I will. I think I said this earlier on, for different reasons, I know, I share a lot of this frustration, because some of the information that hasn't been available, some legal advice, that's down to the government, but for the reasons I've set out, other categories of information, it's not down to the government. Things handed over in criminal trials, it's not in the government's gift to give that. But every time, and I would actually argue this with the legal advice, that there has been information that a lot of mystique and intrigue has been built up around once it has been published, or in the case of some of what the committee got from the Crown Office wasn't published, but you were able to look at that yourself and see that what had been said about it wasn't actually the case. And I think with the legal advice, while people can take different views on the decisions we took, you look at the legal advice in the round and see some of the things that were being said about the government's position are just not borne out in fact. So I get some of the frustration. I share some of the frustration, even if I don't accept the characterisation on all respects of what lies behind that. But I will, with any committee that is saying that it feels that way, I will reflect on that. If there are particular pieces of information that I can today see if the committee still feels it needs and hasn't got, if that information is available, I will undertake to do what we can to provide that to the committee.
Can I say to the First Minister that the time for reflection has actually passed? We've been asking for this information for months. There have been 2 votes in Parliament that, as far as I can recall, you were present for. 2 votes in Parliament demanding the release of legal advice. Endless letters from this committee to John Swinney, your deputy, asking to see legal advice. We didn't want to see it all. We wanted to see Council's opinion. We wanted to see the notes where Council were involved in providing advice to ministers, to the Lord Advocate, to whoever. We haven't got that today. We simply do not have it. And what I would ask you there, then, is what is the legal basis for not giving us the consultation note from the 13th of November with Council? What is the legal basis of not giving us the note of the meeting of Friday, the 2nd of November? What is the legal basis for not giving us the communications with Christine O'Neill? Because I just don't understand that. I genuinely don't.
Well, firstly, I know the Deputy First Minister has said there will be further information coming to the committee. And I'm crossing this line today because I'm sitting in front of the committee, I have deliberately recused myself from the handling of that. So I don't know exactly what the different arguments are in relation to every single bit of information, but that process is still underway, and I'm not going to get into the detail of that when I am not, and it may have been developing as I've been in here today, so I'm not equipped to do that.
But do you accept these are critical bits of information that would have been so useful to talk to you about?
I have spoken. I spoke at length to Murdo Fraser, or not perhaps at length on this particular bit, but in my exchanges with Murdo Fraser, I talked about the consultation on the 2nd of November, which I wasn't at. I talked about the Solicitor General being at that and the outcome of that. So I'm not going to get into specifics there because I am not in possession at this point and all the information about what exists and what can and will be passed to the committee. That is a process that is, I understand it, underway. On the general issue, you know, I'm not going to sit here and rehearse all the arguments about legal advice. The the position on government legal advice is long established and there for good reason. And sitting here right now, I'm glad you've got the legal advice so that I could talk about it openly today. But I have a concern about getting into a situation where government legal advice is routinely asked for and published, because I think that will undermine the basis on which governments properly inform their decisions. But I'm not, going to rehearse that. After the parliamentary votes, the committee went through a process, I understand, with the Deputy First Minister that resulted in the committee, at that point, not quite as unprecedented as what we released yesterday, but at that point was also quite unprecedented, of showing the committee substantial information summarising the government's legal advice. So it's not true to say that the government didn't respond to that, but we have genuinely held views and concerns about the basis on which governments need to be able to take confidential legal advice. And incidentally, when Alex Salmond was First Minister, he held those views as strongly as I do now.
I'm going to intervene here just to say the committee generally shares that frustration that Miss Baillie has expressed. And we will be meeting later today, and considering the legal advice we have received compared to the motion that we passed unanimously some time ago, to see whether the terms of that agreement of the committee has been met, and we will then get straight back on to the government to discuss these issues. And it is noted that Mr Swinney, Deputy First Minister, has in fact said that more information may be available. So that is ongoing. Ms Baillie.
Thank you very much for that helpful point of information, Convener. But, if you take a decision to release legal advice, I am very clear that this doesn't meet the terms of the committee's request, and it is partial. You've taken that decision to release it, not some of it, but actually the legal advice, and we have not yet received that, and I find that really disrespectful to the committee. Let me move on, and I will try and be very quick in terms of areas that Murdo Fraser has already covered. The Council's opinion of the 27th of September, quite clearly at paragraph 6, 58 and 60, questions whether you would succeed on the basis of one particular ground that was suggested in the original petition, and that was ground 4, procedural unfairness. And I think you would accept that paragraph 6, 58 and 60 question whether you would succeed.
I missed at the start.
Sorry.
Which one you were talking about?
27th of September, the very first.
And which paragraphs are you
Council's
talking about?
opinion, 6, 58 and 60.
6, 58 and 60. Okay, carry on.
Okay. Where they note that the vulnerability arises from the procedure itself and not from its implementation in this particular case. So their concern is not just a question of implementation, but the policy itself. And the reason I am so interested in that is because it calls into question the policy you've still got there.
This is a piece of legal advice, and I did try to address this with Murdo Fraser. I have never, I don't know if I can say that in an unqualified sense, I don't think I have ever seen a piece of legal advice about a government decision or a government, a litigation the government was involved in that was absolutely unqualified and said 100% there are no weaknesses in your case. So that, if I had read this and it said there's no potential weaknesses, that might have created more of a question in my mind than it did. Particularly this point of a litigation where it's prospects of success, it's an early, they point out the things they think are of greatest vulnerability. That was what they said was of greatest vulnerability in the case. It didn't mean they thought it was really, really vulnerable and we were definitely going to lose. I guess it's relative as well to the other grounds that they thought were much stronger. So that's how legal advice tends to be presented. Here's the really strong bits and here's the bits that are less strong. It's relative and you take that overall. That does not mean, and I'm not going to sit here and speak for Roddy Dunlop and Christine O'Neill, but certainly I didn't read that as saying you're definitely going to lose the judicial review on this ground. Just relatively speaking, this is your greatest risk and greatest vulnerability.
Okay, let me just quote to you from paragraph 60. This aspect of the case does seem to us to be the most difficult, and we cannot say that there is anything other than a material possibility that the court will agree with the petitioner's complaints in this regard. Isn't it the case that if just one of the petitioner's grounds of challenge are found to be legitimate, then it could lead to the quashing of the decision made by the Permanent Secretary, it could lead to the quashing of the procedure too?
It could have done, yes. I think that is evident and factual. I think also it could have been the case, and I put it no more strongly than that, that a judge may have taken an overall view and come to a decision that there may be weaknesses, but overall the procedure was fair. But the operative word in your questions to me there was could. And can I say genuinely, if the government was on legal advice like this, of, you know, here's your grounds, here's where we think you're strong, here's where you might have a weakness. If the government was to decide not to defend legal action on the basis of opinions like this, the government would never defend any legal action ever. Because you never get an opinion, I don't think, that says you have no vulnerabilities, there is no possibility of losing. So if that's the test you apply, no government anywhere would ever defend a legal action. And I'm not sure you are suggesting that's the position
No, I'm
we should be in.
not. But it was an interesting explanation. And I agree that when you consider the 27th of September, they are suggesting that other grounds are quite weak. So I could see why you would proceed on that basis. But when I come to the opinion of the 31st of October, I find no such positive news anywhere in any of the paragraphs. You know, here was an opinion written by Roddy Dunlop QC on Halloween at 10 to 11 at night. It was urgent. It was genuinely urgent. I mean, you get the sense of that from both the submission and the emails surrounding it. In virtually every paragraph, in fact, in every paragraph, he concludes that the prospects of winning are incredibly slim. I don't see any positive balancing paragraph. Do you?
Just as, and again, I'm probably straying into trying to speak for Roddy Dunlop, which I suspect is really unwise to do. And it was Halloween and it was late at night, and he was clearly seriously concerned. But he also says, you know, my apologies for the hour, I'm been unavailable, I'm engaged in a 3-week proof. So just to give a bit of context there. But to go back to a question I was asked earlier on, I can't remember who by, is it the case that counsel had to threaten to resign? Counsel will not, lawyers will not pursue an unstateable case. And so if Roddy Dunlop or Kristen O'Neill had thought at that point the case was unstateable, they would not have agreed to continue. They thought there was a problem. There was then a consultation 2 days later where the discussion ended with thinking, actually, this is arguable. This section 10, yes, it is open to the interpretation that led Roddy Dunlop to write that note, but equally it's open to the other interpretation, and we think we can argue the alternative interpretation. These are the kind of judgments and decisions that are made in litigation, I imagine, all the time. And I go back to what I said. Fast forward to the 11th of December, and you've still got the law officers, and I'll read again the summary of the position of the law officers. They tested most of the arguments, including the appointment of the investigating officer, and concluded that we have credible arguments. You know, weeks after the 31st of October, the law officers still thought we had credible arguments. Now, there is always going to be a balance of judgment and differences of opinion about what the correct time, if ultimately you lose a court case, what would have been the optimal time to concede that. But taking everything into account, the point at which the government should have conceded this case was not the 31st of October, because that, and you know, if you're going to make that argument, it's much more credible to make it. It's still not right to make it, in my view, but it would be much more credible to make it on the basis of the 6th of December note than it would on the 31st of October note. Now, that's just my view, and that's the view.
I appreciate you guiding me on the questioning, but let me return to the 31st of October.
I wasn't guiding you on the question, I was just giving you my answers to your questions.
Absolutely. Well, let me return to the 31st of October and quote to you from paragraph 14. Where Roddy Dunlop says, it makes little sense to continue to defend the indefensible. Now, previously you spoke about the interests of the two women in this, and I absolutely agree with you. And here is what he goes on to say. The upside to such an eventuality, the procedure would simply be reset safeguards could be put in place to minimise the risk of a further challenge to the renewed investigation. Wouldn't it have been better for the two women if you'd followed that advice?
I'm not... So ultimately, with everything we know now, you can certainly make that case. But, you know, on the 31st of October and around about that, and let me just quote the last paragraph of it, all of that is, however, presently hypothetical. A final decision will require to await the information discussed above. This note is simply provided to ensure that the main decision makers are fully cited in advance of Friday's consultation. Friday's consultation looked at the whole thing and decided actually there was a credible argument that could be made. And at that point, so you're sitting here with, yes, a weakness in the case that hadn't previously been known, a significant weakness, serious problem, I think is the term Roddy and Lopp used. But the consensus view, supported by the law officers, is that there was a credible argument. And actually, this didn't happen, which is why you can apply the hindsight and get to the point you're reasonably making to me. But actually, at that point, I think it was a reasonable judgment to say that it was better for the complainers to try to defend the case and hopefully prevail on the case so that they didn't have to go through a different, a revised and rerun procedure.
We don't know what happened at the meeting on the 2nd of November because we don't have those papers in front of us.
You've made
okay.
that
Well,
point,
no, I'm
yeah.
making it again because there is the obvious difficulty. I have nothing to test your response against. Can I go to one of the obvious areas that they were wanting further information, and that's the role of the investigating officer. Why did it take so long to find out the investigating officer's prior involvement with the complainants when, according to her evidence to the committee, it was widely known?
So at this point, it was believed that the degree of contact between the investigating officer and the complainants was not such that it meant we couldn't argue the interpretation and the fact that the degree and nature of the contact was such that it didn't make the process unfair. Later information came to light, and I cannot definitively answer the question as to why it took so long for that information to come to light, but you know, you can only base decisions on the information you have at the time, and that is the broad summary of the position that pertained on the 31st of October. Of course, this was something, and a large part of the 31st of October note is talking about the obligation of disclosure on the government. So this was disclosed by the government and then became one of the formal challenges in the judicial review. So at each stage, you can and it's perfect, it's part of the committee's job is to look at the thing in the round, to look at it from the perspective of the outcome and work your way back and come to a view on what we got right and what we got wrong. But when you're in the decision-making process, you take the decisions on the basis of the information that is in front of you at the time. And I think at each stage, the decisions that the government reached are absolutely defensible on the grounds of being legally sound and sound in that wider context as well.
Was she spoken to by the Scottish Government's legal department, and if so, when?
Who, sorry?
The investigating officer. Was she interviewed by them?
I don't know.
Okay. She was interviewed by Junior Counsel on the 17th of October.
Oh, sorry, in the context, I understand that statements and affidavits were taken from the investigating officer, so I think I misunderstood.
Okay, do you know when that was?
I don't have the dates of that.
Okay, that would be useful to know. She did meet with Junior Counsel, we understand, on the 17th of October. Again, we don't have a note of that meeting. Would it be appropriate to supply us with that too?
I don't know. I am not involved, not least because I'm sitting here right now in the process of considering what further information the committee will be sent. So I'm not going to answer those questions yes or no, because there will be considerations that are no doubt being and will be undertaken.
Okay. Can I move on to the duty of candour? Because that, of course, requires full disclosure of information by the Scottish Government. Why was a commission on diligence needed? Why did the Scottish Government not hand over the information that would be required and expected of it?
Well, my understanding is the Scottish Government did hand over the information that it thought it had and was complying with the duty of candour as it thought. Information came to light, regrettably, during the Commission on Diligence that then had the result that we have spoken about. There was, to the best of my knowledge, no intention on the part of the Scottish Government to withhold information, but the process demonstrated that there had been information that was not handed over in the proper and timely way.
Okay. I mean, I have to say this mirrors the committee's experience of trying to get information from the Scottish Government. You may recall there was a search warrant issued to the Permanent Secretary from the Crown Office to ingather material for the criminal trial. The committee itself asked for information on the complaints handling phase, and in addition to a number of documents, we got 40 documents not previously seen before, either at the criminal trial or indeed at the Court of Session during the judicial review. Should they have been revealed to the Court of Session in the Crown Office?
I don't know what Sorry, I thought you were finished.
Okay, no. Breaching the terms of a search warrant, I had understood as a layperson, was quite serious. Have I got that wrong?
It would be serious if that is what had happened. It's a bit like some other things that have been put to me. There is an assumption underpinning that question that I don't necessarily accept. I think there has been a suggestion made that, I think from Mr Salmond, that 46 documents were inappropriately withheld from the warrant in the criminal investigation. Scottish Government officials have reviewed the documents that were listed in the submission he made to the committee. Of these, 13 of them were in fact released under the warrant, and others didn't meet the specific terms of the warrant. The government, certainly ministers and the Permanent Secretary, had no role in determining which documents were in scope of the terms of the warrant. There was a rigorous process undertaken, but crucially, the warrant process included oversight by an independent commissioner that was appointed by the court. So where documents weren't handed over, that would have been because a judgment was made that they weren't within the scope of the warrant. But that was not a process I had any direct involvement in.
Okay. Can I move us on to sisting? And you earlier said, I think in response to, might have been Alasdair Allan, about the nature of the attempt to assist the judicial review, which...
To the best of my knowledge, there was no attempt to assist the judicial review. Okay,
but there was discussion about it.
I would have been astounded, given the circumstances, if there wasn't even a... We're talking here about a judicial review where there was a criminal investigation. You would consider, and I think the government did, whether there was any case that there should be an application for assisting. That didn't happen, and instead there was an agreement on the part of the Scottish Government not to oppose the motion for reporting restrictions. And certainly from my memory of those discussions, there was always a sense that reporting restrictions would always be preferable to assisting, because it would allow to go forward. But this idea that the government was trying to get this judicial review assisted is not the case.
Well, we were told by the former First Minister that he had a precognition statement which suggested that a special advisor was encouraging civil servants to come forward as they were out to get him, and that would assist the sisting process.
So I'm going to go on to what I understand from that because I hear these things. Neither have I, but I've made some inquiries. But can I just say, you were told a lot of things by the former First Minister, just as you will be applying your critical faculties to what I'm telling you. I'm sure you're doing the same to his as well. So the government did not try to assist, and that, and to the best of my knowledge, there was no, after the early stages in September that led to reporting restrictions being imposed, there was no, as I said earlier on, I can't sit here and say nobody in the government ever raised the word assisting again. I can't even be sure I didn't raise the word assisting again, but there was no serious attempt at any point on the part of the government to get this case assisted. So this kind of theory seems to fall apart on that really inconvenient fact. On the precognition statement, and I have to piece these things together. I think, forgive me, I think there has been an implication, or not that's putting it too strongly. I think some people perhaps have wanted it to be assumed that the special advisor in this particular fragment of the conspiracy theory, if I can call it that, was my Chief of Staff. My understanding is that's not the case. The Special Advisor that allegedly said this, I think, was asked about it by the police and is adamant that that was not something that was said. But this is also a Special Advisor that would have had no real knowledge or insight into what was happening in the judicial review. Now, I can't say any more than what I've said there because it's just me trying to piece fragments of information together. But probably the most important thing for me to say is, you know, if somebody wants to genuinely argue that the government was trying to game the timing of the judicial review in order to allow it to be overtaken by a criminal investigation, there's a lot of things that really have to be established, a lot of very unlikely and implausible things that really have to be established there, that nobody, as far as I can see, has come within a million miles of doing, probably because it simply did not happen in that way.
I absolutely hope the First Minister's right, but you'll not be surprised to hear that we don't have the paperwork that relates to that. We've been promised it, still to appear.
But if the government had made an attempt to assist the case, presumably that would be, I'm maybe getting this wrong, but presumably that would be known through the court proceedings that there had been an attempt to assist the case.
We've nothing from the government, despite requesting it, and they've promised to deliver it, so maybe you could hurry them up. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Ms Baillie. Now, I think there's a small question or so from Mr McMillan on the judicial review, and then I will ask him to move straight into the Ministerial Code, for which he also has a couple of questions. Mr McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to follow on from a couple of Jackie Baillie's questions, and it was touched upon a moment ago that the Scottish Government didn't send anyone to the lodging of the complainers process. Can you explain why the Scottish Government didn't send anyone to that place?
Forgive me, Mr McMillan, I'm not 100% sure. Is this about the...
Yeah, that was the motion.
For reporting restrictions?
Yeah.
As I understand it, and I'll stand to be corrected if I'm getting this wrong, it's because we weren't opposing it, so there was no need for the government to turn up to say we're not opposing it. As far as I understand, that's not unusual in court proceedings. If a motion is unopposed, then there's no need for everybody to be there in court to do that. So my understanding is that's the explanation of that.
Okay, thank you. In your time as a minister, have you ever seen any legal advice from council that predicted defeat for the Scottish Government, but that the Government then went on to win?
I'm conscious here of we have waived legal privilege in the legal advice in this matter. We have not waived legal privilege, so the Ministerial Code still applies in terms of legal advice on all other issues. So I could not confirm or deny the content or provenance of legal advice on other matters. So I'm not doing that because that would be taking me into difficult territory. But I commented in general terms that you will get, you'll get a spectrum of opinion in any litigation on any issue, and sometimes in the course of a litigation it will move backwards and forwards in terms of we're really confident, oh we're not so confident now, and back again, and that would not be unusual. And I use minimum pricing because it's the one that I've been most closely associated with and involved in, obviously these matters aside, in my ministerial career, and also because it was a very long, protracted litigation, went all the way to the Supreme Court, if I recall. And I use that to illustrate that point, but I can't go into the content of any legal advice on any particular issue.
Okay, thank you. Both the Lord Advocate and the former Director of Legal Services were quite candid about the Government's failings in locating and sharing all relevant documents with Mr Salmond as part of the judicial review. How can the Scottish Government procedure change so that the Scottish Government are in a much better position to make the information more available, certainly in terms of future documents, which are necessary in any litigation?
Look, the Government will be learning lessons on all of this. I know that. I can't give you specific answers to that right now in terms of the technical things that no doubt the government is trying to improve around document retrieval. These are never simple things. The sheer volume of documents that go through government systems on a daily, weekly, monthly basis is you know, massive. And part, you know, I'm not making excuses here, but that will have been part of the issue here. I don't know, I'm not an expert on how, you know, these kind of searches are done, but you use keywords and phrases and such like. So given the volume of information that the government has, it's a complex process. It didn't work at all times here the way it should have worked, and that's had the consequences that we've been talking about. So, you know, these will be things that we will be seeking to improve and learn from in the future.
Thank you. And just one final question in this area. It goes back to the document that was published yesterday, the legal advice from the 27th of September, which Ms Baillie touched upon. Do you have any comments or thoughts about the Council's advice in that document regarding the retrospective element of the case and the procedure?
I'm not sure which document you're referring to.
So it's the legal advice that was published yesterday, the one, the 27th of September.
The note of prospects.
Yeah.
I would say nothing in addition to what I've said already. Well, I'm about to repeat what I said already. That note of prospects was covering all the grounds of challenge and looking at what the view was around all of them. Can't immediately recall exactly what it said on the retrospectivity ground, but all of that would have been taken into account as we considered our prospects. I don't know whether you want to point me to the paragraph.
It's the paragraphs 39, 40, 47 and 48. The reason why I asked the question is because of certainly Mr Salmond discussed at length when he was in front of us on Friday and viewed the aspect of the retrospectivity as a strength for his case. However, the Scottish Government's Council stated that, and I quote, there had been an increased public focus on historical allegations of harassment and on the failure of those who had experienced harassment to make complaints at the time of the alleged harassment changes, i.e. changes in procedure are often retrospective and legitimately so.
Well, thanks for helping me out there. I couldn't find the... I mean, that goes to the heart of it. Mr Salmond has a view that he says was backed up by his legal advice, which it may well have been, that retrospectivity was inappropriate and would have been a legal flaw in the procedure. My view and the government's view is different, both on the legal basis, but also on the appropriateness of allowing complaints of a historic nature to be investigated.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to the Ministerial Code. Okay. So in your opening statement, First Minister, and also with your written evidence, you provided an account of why you met or had contact with Mr Salmond. Can you briefly take us through these reasons? Basically, because I was being, in summary, I can go into as much detail as you want. In summary, because I was being told that he was facing an issue, he was distressed, he, as I was told, and I don't know what the basis of this was, he may be considering stepping aside, resigning from SNP membership. So as a friend of Alex, as a party leader, that was the basis in which I chose to meet him. And, you know, I've set out in my opening statement, I've set out in my written evidence that was the basis. The decisions I then took from that around not immediately notifying that under the Ministerial Code, and I suspect I'm slightly responsible for this myself because I talked a lot about the party basis of that. That decision wasn't really based on the classification of the meeting. That was down to a consideration of how best I protected the independence and the confidentiality of the process. And I go into that in my written evidence, and I touched on it in my opening statement today. What, in your view, was Mr Salmond's motivation for attending?
I think when he got there and we had the discussion on the 2nd of April, it is as he has set out. He wanted me to intervene initially to try to bring about a process of mediation. I believed that I was seeing him, I didn't believe it, I knew I was seeing him in the party personal space, but he clearly had a different objective coming into that. And, you know, when we had that discussion on the 2nd of April, it very quickly became clear to me that what I had thought he might be about to do was not the case. And I thought it was not appropriate for me to intervene in the way that he was asking me to do. You know, this whole issue of, I mean, I heard him rebut it, and perhaps, you know, he never had any intention of resigning, but it was put to me that he was potentially considering that, given that he was handling a difficult situation. I don't know whether Jeff Aberdeen, who told me that, was telling me because Alec had told him that, or whether it was just Jeff's surmising, but that was something that I thought was a prospect or a possibility. You know, knowing Alec as I did, and knowing Alec as many of you do, the one thing you always have in your mind about Alec is that he doesn't do the expected things. So initially, facing a difficult situation, did I think it credible that he would decide to handle it by saying, I'm going to stand down from the party to clear my name? I thought it was credible. To be perfectly honest, that was something that stayed in my mind for longer. That although after speaking to him on the 2nd of April, it was clear that he wanted to deal with it in a particular way so that it didn't become, you know, public or anything, there was always a thing in my mind that if Alec had got to the point where, you know, he thought that was just not going to be possible, it was always a prospect he would just decide to take control of the narrative and handle it in a different way. And that was, you know, just a factor that was in my mind throughout, you know, that period from him, from that meeting on the 2nd of April through that summer.
Thank you for that. You've described meeting Mr Salmond on more than one occasion, and certainly on one of those particular occasions, and you've put in your evidence that you didn't want to be cornered by Mr Salmond at an upcoming party conference, which you thought might occur if you hadn't discussed the matter with him beforehand. What do you mean by cornered?
That might not have been the best word to you. You know what SNP conferences are like. So just to deal with the chronology of this. This was after I had become, certainly the prospect in my mind had become much more serious, that he was contemplating legal action against the government. And that was the point at which, notwithstanding my reasons for not telling the Permanent Secretary beforehand, I decided I had to tell the Permanent Secretary because of that threat of legal action. And that's what I did in, I think, on the 6th of June. I told her in the letter I wrote her that I would make Alec aware that I had told her and reiterate that I wouldn't intervene. So that was the purpose of that meeting. I also knew that we had our party conference at the end of that week. I assumed he was going to be there. Actually, as it turned out, I don't think he was planning to be there, but I assumed he'd be there. And I just didn't want that discussion potentially to happen, you know, in a sort of ad hoc way. I wanted that to be planned. So I arranged to meet him to effectively say, I've told the Permanent Secretary I'm not going to intervene. I'm summarising here, obviously. That was the meeting at which he wanted me to take away a draft petition for judicial review, I think, which I didn't think was appropriate for me to do.
Okay, well, thank you. According to your evidence, the first time that you actually saw the allegations against Mr Salmond under the Scottish Government's complaints procedure, it was in the meeting on the 2nd of April in your house. You described him, obviously, as a friend of some 30 years, as you've done so numerous occasions today. I think you've described learning of the, and I quote, the gory detail. I think that's from a press report, some alleged press comments from you, of these allegations. Can you expand on that, please?
I will not expand on it very much because I suspect the convener will stop me because we'll be straying into territory that is not the remit of the committee. He showed me the letter he'd had from the Permanent Secretary which set out the details of the complaints that had been made against him. They were distressing and, upsetting details. But he then, and it goes back to what I said earlier on, this was one of the incidents, was an incident he was aware of that he had apologised to somebody for at the time. So he gave me his account of that incident. I should be very clear, he denied the specifics of the allegation in the sense that there was anything that wasn't consensual in it, but he gave me his account, and my view is that his account constituted behaviour that was not appropriate for the First Minister, but I probably shouldn't go into any more detail than that.
Thank you. Mr Salmond's account of what happened when you met and he brought up the complaints against him was that you said, and I quote, "I want to assist," which you took that to mean that you would intervene to advocate for mediation in the first instance. What's your response to Mr Salmond's comments?
I think I answered this in response to Andy Wightman. I just want to paint, or not paint a picture, but give people the context here. I'm sitting in my house. It was Easter, we talk about the 2nd of April, it was Easter Monday. The man that I had worked with, been friends with, in my earlier years, had looked up to so much, had just told me something pretty shocking. My head was spinning. I was dealing with kind of complicated emotions. You're sitting with a friend who's saying, I'm facing this terrible situation. Things like, I'd love to help if I could, kind of thing. It's entirely possible. You say these kind of things. This is a human situation. We're talking about it now as a political scrutiny situation, which is absolutely proper. But in the moment, this was a human situation between two people that knew each other really well. And I think I described this to Andy Wightman. From the minute I saw the letter, I knew that it would not be appropriate for me to intervene. I probably was trying to, soften that for him, maybe from his accounts. I softened that too much. I was also thinking about, in real time, is there anything I have to do? Do I have to report this to anybody? So all of that was going through my head as we were having this discussion. But I did not intervene because, for the reasons I set out very vehemently to Margaret Mitchell, I don't think that would have been appropriate for me to do. The other thing I would just say is what I've just described to you there is also kind of demonstrates this was not, the detail of this was not something that I had 3 days to kind of think about, because I was thinking about it really in real time.
So from the human perspective, is that the reason why that you met Mr Salmond on a few occasions after?
Well, I met him twice after that. The 7th of June, ahead of the SNP conference, I think we've already talked about. The third and final time I met him, in fact, I think it is the final time I met him, full stop, is the 13th of July, round about that July date. And if I'm being very reflective, that's probably the meeting. I think, why did I meet him again here? It was very much in the personal party space. I go back to what I said earlier on, and if he was sitting here right now, he'd say, don't be daft, I'd never do that. But there was always this thing in my head. If he gets to a point where he doesn't think he can stop this in the ways he's trying to, he just does the kind of, Alex Salmond press conference. And so I guess I just wanted to know that I wasn't suddenly facing that at some stage. And, this is maybe the most ironic bit of all. Probably at that stage, I was still a bit concerned about him. So I'm sitting here facing all of this and being accused of being part of a grand conspiracy against him. Actually, some of what probably has led me into trouble is I was concerned about him. So that's why I kind of met him in July. He at that point was putting to me a belief, and I don't know whether it was a genuine belief he had or it was a device to try to draw me in, that I was blocking arbitration, which was not the case because I wasn't part of the discussion.
Thank you. And my final question, Convener. Last week, Mr Salmond said, and I quote, "My view is that there are times in life when, as First Minister, You cannot assist your associates because that would be diametrically opposed to something that you have to abide by. Do you agree?
Yes. And, you know, not surprisingly, he was putting forward the view that this was an occasion where that wasn't the case, and I should have done. But I'm not going to rehearse everything I said to Margaret Mitchell. I feel very strongly that it would not have been right for me to intervene, however much I might, you know, in my heart have wanted to help a friend, although, you know, the nature of this was more complex than that, but it would not have been right for me to do it, and that's why I didn't.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Alex Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Convener. First Minister, I too would like to focus on the meetings of 29th March and 2nd April 2018 and their immediate aftermath. All of my questions are around that. Can I just start by confirming something you told us in your written evidence, that you had no idea that you were going to meet Jeff Aberdeen until he appeared in your parliamentary office on March 29th? Is that accurate?
I didn't know for certain. I had been told that Jeff wanted to see me, that he might be in Parliament that day. I think that was probably the night before. It might have been the morning of. But it was he might be in Parliament, and if so, he wants to have a word with you. I didn't know it was certain that he was going to be in Parliament.
But you were partially prepared for it. And Mr Aberdeen said nothing of the actual investigations at that meeting, but did hint that Mr Salmond might be facing allegations of a sexual nature. That's...
As you know, and it's been the subject of comment and scepticism, and I understand that, I didn't remember this meeting, and my recollection of this meeting is still not as vivid as I would like it to be. It was, I won't go into the detail, it was a colleague's birthday, and we stepped into my office. He indicated there was a harassment issue. To the best of my recollection, it was in general terms. What I remember most strongly is how worried he was about Alec, and the main purpose of the discussion, as I recall it, was to get me to agree to see Alec. Now, the bit where I do agree, and it's part of Alec's evidence on Friday seemed to be suggesting that I wasn't agreeing. I did agree in that meeting to see him. So, in a sense, the 2nd of April meeting was agreed on the 29th of March. I don't think the date was confirmed until over the weekend, but I did agree to see him. But that's what I recall. There was an issue, it was serious, he was really worried about Alec, and I needed to see him. But my best recollection of that is that it was in general terms.
Despite limited information from Jeff Aberdeen on the 29th of March, you agreed to drop everything and meet Alex Allan 4 days later. And you've just said that that was for two reasons in particular. One was personal. He was in a profound degree of distress. And the second was that you'd been told by Jeff Aberdeen that he might well be about to resign from the SNP. Now, when I asked Mr Salmond about this, he was very strident in stating that resignation was the last thing on his mind. Can you tell us what reason did Jeff Aberdeen give you for suggesting otherwise?
I don't really, I can't recall whether Jeff even said, Alec has told me this, or I just am worried about this. It was just something he said. I think he might be, I think he might even be about to resign. And that was what gave me the sense that this was a serious issue, and I really needed to speak to him about it. Let me be clear, within a very short space of Alec being in my house on April the 2nd, it was clear to me that that was not his intention. I still had this, that could always change with Alec. I don't think I'm describing something here that's not recognisable to people. Expect the unexpected was always something you should do with him. My final point is just dropping everything. April the 2nd was Easter Monday. I was due to be at home. My friend of 30 years wants to see me. I agreed that would be the case. I was due to be working at home. My chief of staff, who was at that meeting, was due to be there to see me because I was off to China later on that week. So it wasn't a kind of drop everything to see Alec. It was just a meeting that I agreed to have, and that was the first available and convenient date to do it.
Forgive my poor choice of words. First Minister, yet this massive and devastating fear and belief that you had that your mentor of 30 years was about to quit your party came from a meeting that you claim to have forgotten all about. I'm sorry, First Minister, but do you realise how unlikely that sounds?
So, yeah, I do, actually, and that's part of my difficulty here. I do get the kind of views of that, but it just happens to be the case that wasn't the big significant meeting, and I'll try to explain that with reference to two things. Firstly, my recollection is that that discussion in terms of the detail was general. It wasn't a detailed discussion in terms of the substance, and it was very much, you need to see Alec, will you agree to meet Alec, he's really distressed, he might be about to resign. And actually, given the nature of my relationship with Alec, you know, by that point we weren't seeing each other as often as we had once, but my relationship with Alec was such that I thought there was a big serious issue he was facing. I'd want to hear it from him. I wouldn't want to hear it third hand. But the other point that I think helps explain, certainly helps to explain to me, because I've asked myself, how could I have, you know, forgotten that, is that general concerns, it was not the first time I was hearing a general concern. The Skye Edinburgh Airport thing had created that lingering suspicion. The other thing is, you know, what happened in my house on the 2nd of April, in my dining room with a man, you know, that's been all these things to me for 30 years, was so significant that that is the thing that will live with me forever. And did that maybe slightly obliterate in my mind what came before that? Possibly. But that's the fact of the matter, sitting there, being told not just the complaints, but what he told me in terms of his version of that incident is ingrained in my mind.
So you said repeatedly. First Minister, I want to ask you about Peter Murrell. He told us that as a rule, you don't discuss government business with him, but it's a different story when it comes to party business. Indeed, you told the Daily Record yourself in 2012 that of your relationship with him that you just end up talking about it all the time. You never leave it outside. You've been very clear that you met Mr. Salmond because you've been told by Jeff Aberdeen that he was about, or possibly about, to resign from the SNP, and you would have to prepare the party for that. Those are your words. But you said nothing to Peter Murrell of your concerns, and he just thought that Mr. Salmond was popping in for a chat. Is that correct?
I think it probably merits slightly more explanation. And did you say it was 2012, the Daily Record article? Well, maybe we'd learned by then that we shouldn't spend all our time talking politics, that it wasn't good for a relationship or health or anything else. I just say that flippantly. The fact of the matter is, and you've posited this, I heard you posit to Peter and to others, that surely, you know, if I thought that he was coming to resign and everything, we'd have to have a handling plan in place and everything. I didn't. I worried that something like that was the case, but I wanted to speak to him before I said, here's running with anybody else. I wanted to speak to him confidentially. If he had come into my house on the 2nd of April and said, Nicola, I'm about to resign from the SNP, then of course I would have told people in the party so we could have prepared for that. As it turns out, he didn't tell me that, and I decided I wanted to hear from him what it was he wanted to tell me.
First Minister, there's lots of things that the people watching probably don't understand entirely, whether that's court orders, redacted evidence and so on, but they do understand marriage. If you genuinely thought that you were meeting him in a party,
sure, I do, so
in a party personal space, and thought the party was facing potentially one of its biggest threats in its history, the resignation of the man who'd effectively built it, can you see how hard it is for those people to believe that you would say nothing to your husband, the SNP chief executive, who you have said previously you talk about party business a lot with? Can you see how hard that might be to believe?
Look, I can see how hard all this is for people to understand. All I would say is there's lots of different emotions and factors and considerations. I had been given the impression by Jeff resignation was a possibility. I didn't know, I certainly can't recall exactly what the basis of that was. I didn't think it was a certainty. It was one of the things that meant I wanted to meet him and hear what the situation was. I wasn't going on the basis of having not actually heard whether that was a reality, set my party into sort of crisis mode, preparing to deal with this. Had he sat in my dining room on the 2nd of April and said, I'm going to resign, that would have been very different. But I wanted to hear from him before I started to tell anybody else whether there was a problem we had to be dealing with. And I'm not sure that's impossible for people to understand.
Again, so you've said before, is it not a more plausible explanation, though, First Minister, to those watching, that you actually knew this was government business? That's why you didn't discuss it with your husband, the chief executive of the SNP?
No, I don't think that is necessarily a more... I can see why people might make that assumption, and you know, I guess, yeah, I do understand that. I'm only able to tell you, you know, from my perspective, it was something that I had been told was a problem. I think in answer to you earlier on, I talked about the lingering general concerns, which were clearly strengthened and underlined with the conversation with Jeff. But I wanted to speak to him. I wanted to hear directly from him before I started. So it was something that I thought was confidential, and obviously after I spoke to him, I was even more concerned about respecting the confidentiality of the process. I appreciate that this is, you know, I hope many people, and I hope there's not that many people, certainly in politics, that find themselves in the position of having to deal with serious complaints like this against somebody that was so close to you. But, you know, did I deal with all of this perfectly? Did I deal with it in a, you know, a clinical kind of way that with hindsight everybody can get? Absolutely. I mean, maybe not, but I dealt with it the best I could. And, you know, people will draw their own conclusions and make their own judgments about that.
But talking to someone you share a house with is not a clinical way of dealing with. I'll move on, First Minister. I think you made that very clear. I want to just turn briefly to the question of why Mr. Salmond left your house with the impression that you were going to help him. Now, you answered very clearly to Andy Wightman in his discussion around the conflicting evidence we've now received from yourself and from Duncan Hamilton QC around whether you had made the offer to assist. And you said to, I wrote it down, you said to Mr. Wightman that you perhaps let him down more gently than you intended to. Those were your words. But your evidence to us could not have been clearer. It said, I made clear to him that I had no role in the process and would not seek to intervene in it. That doesn't sound like letting him down gently at all, does it?
I did make clear to him that I had no role in the process. He could see that himself because I think he had a copy of the process. And I think I made it clear that I wouldn't intervene. Now, I am, given what he said, given what Duncan has said, you know, yeah, did I make that clear enough? Did I, in discussing with him and hearing what he thought should happen, did I make that clear enough? And I'm not, so in sense, disputed evidence, I'm not saying if Duncan says I said something like that, but when I look at the things that I am being accused of saying, they don't strike me as being, yeah, I'm going to intervene. It's things like, well, yeah, I'll help if it's appropriate, or if it comes to, I don't know, if it comes to what, the Permanent Secretary's got to tell me. The Permanent Secretary, under this procedure, wouldn't tell me till the end. It sounds as if I was not actually thinking of intervening. But, you know, if he left there with the impression that I was, then, you know, that clearly was not the impression I wanted to give him. But the crucial part in this, or a crucial part in this, is I didn't intervene. I didn't intervene. And I've heard it put to me today that I should have intervened, but I didn't. And that, so, you know, whatever way I was expressing myself and whatever discussions I was taking part in, I did not intervene in the process.
With respect, that's not what we're looking at here, First Minister. We're looking at what you've told this inquiry in your written evidence, juxtaposed with what Duncan Hamilton, who is a QC, who has also suggested he'd be willing to repeat these assertions under oath and knows full well what that would do to his reputation in the faculty of advocates and everything else, where he said explicitly that, and I quote, my clear recollection is that her words were, if it comes to it, I will intervene. That is not any suggestion of letting Mr. Salmond down gently, and nor is it along the lines of what you've written to us.
I don't know what that would mean in the context of what we were dealing with. If it comes to what there was an investigation underway. So I don't know. All I'm trying to explain here, and it's imperfect, and I get that, is I'm in this discussion where, you know, I've been told something shocking and upsetting. I'm trying to process it all in my mind as I go, and you know, maybe I express myself in ways that I shouldn't have done. I'm not sitting here saying I didn't, but I believed that I had been clear that I could not and would not intervene in this process.
But with respect again, First Minister, you're focusing on the wrong set of words. You know, if it comes to it, is not that important as important as in I will intervene. It doesn't matter
I don't
the context.
So those particular
we'll
words,
move on.
I don't.
I appreciate we're not going to agree on this. I'm just coming to an end, Convener. If I appreciate your patience with me. The problem is, First Minister, that actually Duncan Hamilton's statement here is actually borne out by some of the facts, not least Mr Salmon's messages to you bear out Mr Hamilton's version. He certainly left with the impression that you were going to help. He said on the 3rd of June, my recollection of our Monday, 2nd April was rather different. You wanted to assist. Now, I understand that you have told us that perhaps you left him with the wrong impression. And I don't think anyone's suggesting that you did make good on that promise, but this is the impression he left with. But the other thing that really sticks with me is the delay in you telling the Permanent Secretary. It was, you finally told Leslie Evans about the April meeting on 6th of June. That's more than 2 months later. That's over 60 days of you seeing the Permanent Secretary in government on almost daily basis. We know how often you meet with her. And yet, while you spoke and texted with Mr Salmond from time to time, you said nothing to her. Now, wouldn't you suggest that the transparent thing to have done would have been to say to the Permanent Secretary from the outset that you'd had this unsolicited approach from Mr Salmond? But isn't it right, though, that you didn't do that? Because initially you were minded to help him.
No, that's not the case. If I didn't express myself clearly enough, then that's something I'll have to, hold my hands up to. But that is not the case. I was, in my own mind, absolutely clear from the outset that I could not and would not intervene in the process. In terms of the decision around not notifying this to people in government, I've set that out in my written evidence. I've said it out again today. And again, people can decide whether they think I made the right judgment or the wrong judgment. I looked at the Ministerial Code. The Ministerial Code imposes a range of obligations on ministers. Sometimes in situations they can feel conflicting and you have to make a judgment. The relevant sections of the code in terms of notification, the 422, 423, are about a situation where I'm at a party conference and a company lobbies me about a decision that I'm actually involved in. It's about guarding against undisclosed influence on decisions you're taking. This felt to me the opposite. This was a decision I was not party to, I wasn't meant to know, and actually the risk that those sections are meant to guard against would more likely arise if I told people within government. Any conversation that started with me saying, Alex Salmond has told me about this, even unintentionally and inadvertently, does that make the people doing the investigation think that there's a particular thing I'm trying to bring about? That was the first reason. The second reason, if you read the code in that respect, notifying meetings in that way involves publication, and you might all tell me I'm wrong here, but if a meeting had suddenly appeared in my published diary, Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, people would have wanted to know what that was about. So there would also have been a risk to the confidentiality. That's the judgment I arrived at. That's what, this committee is looking at it, but that is one of the issues James Hamilton has to make. Did I get that judgment right or did I not? But the Ministerial Code also, at other sections, says I have an obligation to respect the impartiality of civil servants and respect the confidentiality of government business. So I weighed up all of that and I came to a judgment. It's for other people to judge if I was right or wrong, but I think I made the best judgment overall, and I think I made a judgment that was, in that respect, certainly defensible. And in my view, I think I made the appropriate one.
And final question, Convener. And when you finally told Leslie Evans of the April 2nd meeting with Mr Salmond, did she instruct you in any way to sever all contact with him, to not meet him again or speak to him again?
No, I wrote to Leslie Evans. I think the committee's got a copy of that letter. I think I'd indicated to her verbally in passing that something of that nature was coming, so that it didn't just land on her without any warning. And she replied to acknowledge receipt. I advised her in that letter that I was going to make Mr Salmond aware that I had told her, and reiterate again that I wouldn't intervene.
Thank you, Convener.
Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just following on from Alex Cole-Hamilton's questioning, Mr Salmond said to us that he thought you should have informed officials in the civil service as soon as it became clear that the meeting of the 2nd of April was related to a government matter. Did he say this to you at the meeting on the 2nd of April, or at any time later?
I don't recall him quoting the Ministerial Code. If he had done, I would have been as surprised as I was when I heard him talk about having copious knowledge of the Fairness at Work policy, but that's another matter. So I don't recall him quoting the Ministerial Code at me, but he wanted me to tell the Permanent Secretary I knew so that I could use my influence to bring about a process of mediation. I don't think I'm saying anything here that he's not saying himself. He's been, to be fair to him, he's been perfectly upfront about that, and he is making a case, and people have got a choice to make as to whether they agree with that. He's making a case for why he thinks I should have done that. I'm not saying there's no, to use the phrase we've been using, I'm not saying he doesn't have a stateable case. I just think it would have been the wrong thing for me to do.
So if he didn't sort of say to you at the time that you should be doing that then, why do you think he's saying that now?
I'm not sure he is saying, forgive me, I didn't watch all of the 6 hours on Friday, but the bits I saw and I've read through, I'm not sure he's saying he expressly quoted the Ministerial Code to me. I think he was saying he thought I should tell the Permanent Secretary and saying that he thought that was part of my obligations under the Ministerial Code. But on the 2nd of April, to the best of my recollection, he wasn't couching it in the Ministerial Code. He was couching it in the sense of, this is an outrageous thing I'm being subjected to, this procedure is wrong, there should be mediation, and you should help me bring that about. And I think some of the text messages, or to be accurate about it, they're WhatsApp messages. I think some of those show that later on, the sort of Ministerial Code issues that he was bringing into the discussion were around making sure the government was acting legally and lawfully, which I believe I did.
Yes, he did say to us, and I quote, "The First Minister is duty-bound to act if she has a reasonable belief that our government is in danger of behaving in an unlawful fashion." What's your response to that? And again, did he communicate this view to you at the time?
So I knew, because he told me, that his lawyers were corresponding with the government. So therefore, I had an assumption that the government would be engaging in the legal points that his lawyers were putting across. So I didn't, just ignore that. But I weighed up the different obligations that I thought I was under. That had I intervened in the way he wanted, that would have satisfied what he thought my obligations were, but I think I would have been acting improperly by intervening on his behalf because of our relationship in a process that I wasn't meant to be involved in. Now, when we got to the stage where it was clear that he wasn't talking about legal action in sort of the abstract, but was very seriously considering legal action, I then took the decision to inform the Permanent Secretary that he had said that to me as I suppose, part of being sure that the government had awareness so that they were taking the proper steps to ensure that the government was acting appropriately legally. So life as a minister would be much easier if these things were all binary and you could point for every situation to a provision in the Ministerial Code and it answered the question for you. It doesn't. We face every day complex decisions that we have to balance the different factors and act in a way that we feel is appropriate overall and aligns with the multitude of obligations that the Ministerial Code place on us, and that's what I sought to do.
Okay, thank you.
Move now to Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I can follow up some of the questions we had from Alex Cole-Hamilton around the meeting on the 29th of March, because initially, when you were asked about this, in Parliament, you didn't acknowledge that meeting had taken place. Subsequently, you said it had. And in your written evidence to this committee, you say initially you essentially had forgotten about it until you're reminded of it. And you say, I think it did cover the suggestion that the matter might relate to allegations of a sexual nature. I think I'd have to share Mr. Cole-Hamilton's scepticism about your forgetfulness in this respect. If I can try and put this in parallel terms, at the time you were deputy to Alex Salmond, I was deputy to Annabel Goldie. If somebody had said to me in a meeting that Annabel Goldie had been accused of accusations of sexual harassment, I think that would have stuck in my memory. I don't think I would have just have forgotten about that. I would have been so shocked and appalled by news like that I probably wouldn't have slept a wink that night. It wouldn't have just gone out of my mind. So yeah, I think you'll understand why we're struggling to believe that the story that you just forgot about this meeting.
Story, it's an account of what happened, and I do understand that, which is why I'm trying to explain the relative import and significance of the two meetings. The other factor around the 29th, as well, is, to the best of my recollection, it was a general discussion focused really on getting me to meet Alex Salmond so that we could talk directly on the issue. By that time, and again I set this out in my written evidence, the whole episode around, if I can call it that, around the Sky News Edinburgh Airport query had left me with a kind of lingering fear, suspicion, concern, call it what you want, that something might appear. So in a sense, that kind of general concern, that general discussion, if that had been the first time I'd ever heard any suggestion of complaints of sexual misconduct against Alex Salmond, that might be true, but it wasn't. And then on the other side of that, April the 2nd, in terms of sitting there in my own house, reading a letter with all of the detail and hearing his account of it, is what is the strong memory in my mind. I appreciate that people might think, how could you forget that? But I'm trying to set out here what actually happened. And I have struggled a lot with, you know, why did I not remember the 29th of March? I've been struggling to try to remember as much as I can about the content of that discussion. When this first came to light, and I was in my own mind trying to think, when was it I found out about this? In my mind, just instinctively, it wasn't a choice between the 2nd of April and the 29th of March. What I would try to, and I remember doing it when it first became public, I was checking the date of Easter Monday, because it was Easter Monday that we met, and I was like, what date was Easter Monday? So, rightly or wrongly, to use your words, you know, people can be sceptical about that, but I hadn't remembered the 29th as being the big significant factor in this, and you know, in many ways I really wish I had, because if I had, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be sitting here answering a lot of these questions, but I wouldn't be sitting here trying to explain that to you, and I'm trying to explain it to the best of my ability and the best of my recollection.
Okay, you claim that the meeting on the 29th of March was effectively a chance meeting, an informal meeting, it wasn't pre-arranged. That is contradicted by Jeff Aberdeen, and we know that because that is reflected in the evidence we've had from Mr Salmon, we had it last Friday, and also corroborated by Duncan Hamilton and by Kevin Pringle. Now, I asked Mr Salmon explicitly about this when he was here on Friday, sitting where you're sitting, and he said this, it is absolutely certain that the meeting on 29th March in the Scottish Parliament was pre-arranged for the express purpose of Nicola being briefed on the situation with regard to me and complaints.
I can't speak to what Alec thought or what Alec was told in all of this. I can only speak to, so I said earlier on, I knew that Jeff, so in the sense that I didn't walk out of my office and find him there and I didn't know anything about it. I had been told, I think the night, I think it was the night before, this was a Thursday, so usually on a Thursday morning I'm focusing on other matters, that Jeff may well be in Parliament the next day and wanted to see me. So in that sense, if that is what, if Jeff thought that was pre-arranged, then that's the basis on which I understood it. What is definitely the case is that in that meeting, I agreed to see Alec. So I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that the genesis of the 2nd of April meeting was in the 29th of March meeting.
I think the claim is the meeting was set up by your office.
My understanding is that Jeff had asked to see me. Clearly, it was through people in my office that request was conveyed.
So the meeting was not at the request of your office?
Not as far as I'm concerned.
Because that is directly contradicted by the evidence we've had from the former First Minister, and his version of events is corroborated by Duncan Hamilton and by Kevin Pringle.
So I may have missed something. The idea that I thought Alex Salmond's evidence was that Jeff had wanted to come to see me, to brief me, and I wasn't asking to be briefed on matters. The request was Jeff wanted to come and see me and might be in Parliament the following day.
Well, I think when we read the evidence that's here from Duncan Hamilton, corroborated by Kevin Pringle, it's clear that they're supporting the former First Minister's version of events.
On what
and
point? I'm
not your own.
I don't have it in here, but I'm not going to waste time digging it out. But in terms of the meeting on the 29th of March was requested by my office?
I'd have to just double check what Mr. Salmon said in the official report about that. He certainly said the meeting was pre-arranged.
So I've explained that bit, but I may be wrong here, but I was not of the view that he claimed it had been requested.
Right, I will...
Anyway, I'm happy to come back.
I can come back to that, I think.
Can I suggest,
Exactly.
Mr Fraser, that you go on to your other questions and we can ask our clerks to check that?
Yeah, fine, I will do. Thank you, Convener. You see, but this all comes back to the question of corroboration. I put this to you earlier because we had a conversation this morning about the claims that the name of a complainant had been passed on to the former First Minister, to Jeff Aberdeen and then to the former First Minister. And you said, well, you basically denied that, and I pointed out to you that these claims were corroborated by the evidence we've had. I mean, why would people like Duncan Hamilton and Kevin Pringle band together to make these claims if they weren't true?
I'm not suggesting anybody's doing that. All I'm saying is Duncan and Kevin weren't in either of the conversations. So what they were told about them, I can't speak to. There was a third person in the room on the 29th of March. Again, it would be somebody the committee was able to take private evidence from. So in a sense, how do I corroborate that? There was a third person in the room. On the 29th of March, so I'll come back to something I said in my opening statement. I absolutely accept that my, forgetting about the meeting and then genuinely my recollection of the 29th of March not being as clear as I would like it to be is not helpful to me, let alone anybody else. But I come back to this, why would I have gone to such great lengths to conceal the 29th of March? I don't think, if I had known everything in the 29th of March, the fact I was being told that he was in distress and might resign, I think I would probably still have agreed to see him. And my decisions around notifying, as I said, were not actually based on the classification of the meeting. They were based on my considerations of the independence and confidentiality of the process. So I don't think, had the 29th of March been something more than I am remembering, that it would have changed the course of things. So I come back to this. Why would I have gone to such great lengths and the jeopardy of that to sort of conceal that it happened? It doesn't make sense in my mind that I would have done that.
I've now found the quote I was searching for and couldn't lay my finger on a moment ago. It's in paragraph 75 of the former First Minister's evidence. And he says this, I'll just quote it to you. He told me the meeting was going to take place on 29th March, as you know. Mr. Aberdeen had been approached by another official who had brought him into the process. The meeting was taking place with a view to briefing Nicola and arranging for the meeting for 2nd of April.
Again, we're getting into territory here that we were in earlier on where I've got to be careful what I say, but it is not my understanding that the meeting on the 29th of March was requested by my office. It was Jeff Aberdeen wanting to come to see me. Again, these are people that can be heard from by the committee in private. There was one other point I can't remember the other point I wanted to make, so it might come back to me. My apologies.
Can I move on and talk briefly about the meeting on the 2nd of April? Because when we had Peter Murrell, your husband, in this committee sitting where you are now, I asked him about this meeting, and he was very clear in his view that this was a meeting on Scottish Government business. And I pressed him on that because I was quite surprised that he was so adamant that that was his view, but that was very clearly his view. Now, perhaps when you got home you had words with him, but that was the position he took.
I wouldn't have had words with him because I might have thought doing so would have jeopardised me getting my tea that night. So, look, he didn't know the basis of the meeting. So he's also, appearing in front of a parliamentary committee like this one is not normal for any of us, but it's more normal to sit in front of a parliamentary. He's not, practiced at sit in front of a parliamentary committee. That was his I guess, assumption based on the fact I wasn't telling him what was going on. He didn't know the basis of the meeting, and I think he said that he was drawing from my evidence. But can I emphasise this point again? I think it might be the third or fourth time I've done it, and the reason I'm doing it is because I actually take responsibility for the confusion here. What I decided to do and not to do as a result of that meeting in terms of notification under the Ministerial Code was not down to my classification of whether it was party or government. I thought it was, the meeting was, I agreed to the meeting on party personal grounds. Clearly what he came to discuss with me was a government investigation. What I decided to do then though wasn't, I've got to say this was a party meeting and not a government so I don't have to notify it. My decision on that was based on what I've already set out. My view that by telling people in the government that I knew would potentially compromise the independence and the confidentiality. So that is a bit that I think I have managed to convey properly, which is why I'm trying to explain that today. So in a sense this, but if it was government, not party, so you must have breached the code, that was not the basis for the decisions I took around notification under the Ministerial Code.
Well, you say that Mr Murrell wasn't clear what the meeting was about, but he was very clear when he answered our questions that he thought it was a government
He
meeting.
was also, I've read all of the evidence, I've read his evidence. He was also, I think, in fact, I know he was making the point that he was basing his answers on his interpretation of my written evidence. But the point of the matter is, he wasn't in a position to judge the basis of the meeting. So he was making assumptions on the basis of evidence that he had read.
Do you think people giving evidence to a parliamentary committee under oath should make assumptions when they answer questions?
I think, like I am doing today, people should try to be helpful, and I believe, having read his evidence, that he appeared before this committee on 2 occasions, and I believe he answered the questions appropriately and truthfully.
Okay. After the former First Minister gave evidence here on Friday, a spokesman for the Scottish Government said there was no evidence to back up the claims he made. The committee has now found evidence. The committee has had corroboration of various statements he made from Duncan Hamilton and from Kevin Pringle, as we've pointed out to you. Would you withdraw the Scottish Government's statement there's no evidence? It's quite clear there is evidence.
Well, I wouldn't accept, and this is not me questioning the sincerity of the statements that have been made, but I don't believe that it adds up to what you're saying. You're talking about people who weren't in either of the discussions, so they are reporting things that they were told. Now, you know, part of, and it is hugely frustrating for me, that for reasons I entirely understand, the people who were in these discussions, apart from me in relation to the 29th of March, are not able to give their accounts. Now, they can't do that publicly here for reasons that we're all aware of. They can do it to James Hamilton, and you know, he will reach whatever conclusions he reaches. And as I say, it would be open to the committee to speak to them privately to get their account. So I don't accept the assumptions and characterisations you were making. I think when I was speaking last week about evidence, I would add to this more generally, but you know, I was specifically in many occasions, not many, a couple of occasions last week, talking about the complete lack of evidence of the suggestion that all of this was some plot that had been dreamt up against Alex Salmond, which there is, in my view, zero evidence of.
Okay, I don't want to get into plots. Well, I'm not interested in pursuing that. But you being a lawyer will be well aware that contemporaneous statements count towards corroboration, and therefore the evidence we have from Duncan Hamilton and Kevin Pringle points to contemporaneous statements.
But can I just make the point, I'm not really making it as a lawyer, just as a person, you know, having contemporaneous statements from people who were told things when you haven't heard from the people who actually supposedly said them would seem to me to be a bit of a missing bit. Well,
but you're still alleging, First Minister, that the source of all this, that Jeff Aberdeen, is giving a false set of events. I'm not. I haven't heard Jeff's evidence directly. Jeff, you know, one of the distressing personal things for this is the relationships that have been collateral damage. Jeff is somebody that I
think very highly of. I am fond of him. We've not been able to speak because of this. So I'm not here to cast aspersions, but there are different accounts, and I think, I was present on the 29th of March. I wasn't present in the other one, but the views of the people who were there to explain whether these are just clashing accounts or whether there is actually an explanation for a misunderstanding. I think hearing from the actual people is really an essential part of a process. If you're then, you don't have the account that you are seeking to corroborate before you get to the corroborating evidence.
Okay, you've accused Alex Salmond on a number of occasions of spreading dangerous conspiracy theories. Aren't you effectively doing the same yourself by painting this group of individuals close to Alex Salmond as being part of a conspiracy?
No, I haven't. Point me to where I have said that.
Well, you're suggesting, you've just done it. You've just suggested that the evidence we've been presented with may not be correct.
I am suggesting, I have not heard the direct account from Jeff Aberdeen, so I'm making the point that there are often different accounts of conversations, and unless you have heard from the people who had the conversation, there's a really big hole in the picture you're trying to construct. I am not here accusing anybody of anything. I'm not doing that. I'm saying I have a different, I have a different understanding based on what I have been told. And on the conversation that I was a party to, I've tried, to the best of my recollection, to give you an account of that. The two other people in the room, Jeff Aberdeen and another individual, I don't know what the committee's seen from Jeff, but on the other one, hasn't heard from. So I'm not accusing anybody of a plot or a conspiracy or anything. I think there's probably been enough of that in this whole episode.
Okay. Finally, Convener, you've said some very harsh things about the former First Minister. Now, as a political opponent, I've said some harsh things about him myself, and others around the table have, but that might be expected from us. But you're an ally. You've been a close political friend of his for 30 years. You were his deputy when he was First Minister and succeeded him as leader of the SNP and First Minister. And all through that period, you told the Scottish people we should trust Alex Salmond. He was a man of integrity and honour, not least when he was leading your party to try and win the independence referendum. You're now telling us that we shouldn't believe a word he says. So when did you decide that Alex Salmond was no longer the Charles Stuart Parnell of Scotland, but was in fact a liar and a fantasist?
I haven't used those words. And so I did all of, this is where you get into deeply personal territory. I've learned things about Alex Salmond over the past couple of years that have made me rethink certain things I thought about him. No doubt he would say the same about me, because he's said harsh things about me as well, and I've had to go through a process of reassessing all sorts of things around that. And as I was watching him on Friday, lashing out, that's my words, against us, I don't know whether he ever reflects on the fact that many of us, including me, feel very let down by him. And, that's a matter of deep personal pain and regret for me. I think I probably should stop there.
Well, finally then, do you not think, given that you asked us all to trust him for so long, you owe an apology to the people of Scotland for asking us to do that?
I trusted him, and I am not going to apologise for the behaviour of somebody else. If I have things in my behaviour to apologise for, I will apologise. But I do not think it is reasonable to ask me to apologise for the behaviour, some of which he will deny, of course, of Alex Salmond. I think the only person who should apologise for any behaviour on his part, which he was asked to do on Friday and failed to do, is Alex Salmond.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think this is an appropriate time to be saying time has run on, and I still have 3 members, First Minister, who wish to question you. But I'm also at the point where, in line with the agreed mitigations to allow us to meet safely in person today, I have to suspend the session. So I think we should reconvene at 4:30 and aim to be finished for 5 o'clock. Can I remind members and everyone else to observe social distancing when leaving the committee room and during the break? And I suspend this session.